to the key personnel that helps me.
Yes.
Even them, when they go out and go back to their office, they have green terrace in mind, you know.
Yes.
And so, yeah, I think my key to success has been definitely having been supported by the right people at the right times, and also showing my worth, showing that I can deliver, showing that I can do business,
Yes.
showing that I am in farming for business.
Yes.
Because farming is business at the end of the day. This is not a hobby.
Yes.
There's a lot of investment, personal or financial. There's a lot of investment that I've done also personally in this space. So I'm taking my business very seriously. And I think once you're able to communicate that to individuals, they'll take you seriously too.
Yeah, because I do think there are so many learnings for other people that are looking to get into the sector. And, you know, at what stage did, well, firstly, why farming? It's quite a radical change from what you studied and what you started out doing.
Yeah.
Why farming? Because in many ways, farming, you've got a feel for it, there's a passion for it. And I don't know what your reason is, but I'd love to hear. And then the second part of it is, when did people start taking you sort of seriously, you know? And either the staff you started to attract, say, okay, I'm going to get paid at the end of the month, and your external networks. Was there a turning point, or was it just your persistence? Was it just time? Or was it your character that came through? You know, what was it that got you over the line and people said, this is someone to back?
Yeah. So firstly, I had a business that I ran successfully about for 3.5 years prior to my entry into the agriculture industry. And towards the latter part of that business, before I closed that business, I really wanted to just be in a sector where it wasn't too saturated. So what I mean by saturated, so I ran a recruitment company where I was recruiting engineers and artisans, some expats, some from local markets, some international markets, and rightfully so, I was good at that, right? But it came a point where I think towards the third and fourth quarter of 2015, the first quarter of 2016, the economy from an employment perspective was shrinking in South Africa. And I thought, you know, I couldn't really churn the business.
Yes.
I mean, I'm at the mercy of corporates, right? If corporate South Africa is not hiring, then what's the purpose of my business existing then?
Yes.
So fortunately, I think it was just it was perfect alignment. It was God's timing. And when I looked into the agri industry, I found an industry that was like, oh, it's not too saturated. Like in recruitment, you know, at every corner in the street within Johannesburg, there's a recruitment company. And you kind of have to prove yourself in that sea of many recruitment companies in terms of what is your differentiator. And then when I came into the agri industry, I thought, okay, wow, you know, a lot of females that I read about in that space, it's either their wives of farmers or their children of farmers who are playing a supportive role in the company, you know, accountants, admins, and so forth. And I thought, okay, there's not a lot of female farmers. This is a place where I can penetrate in. And just personally, I'm a huge love of risk, you know, and that for me excited me. And it's just seeing all the challenges that people, just from my bare minimum research, all the challenges that were just listed as a new entrant farmer. It's difficult to get into retail. It's difficult to access land. It's difficult to access information. It's difficult to access markets. I thought, okay, all these stumbling blocks is just something that I could strive for.
Yeah.
And you know, without bragging, I think just when I think of my journey, I'm quite proud that a lot of these things that when I come into the space, the things that I'd read, I've kind of overcome those challenges by purely being determined and hardworking, and approaching doors that are just, were not necessarily closed, but just people weren't open.
You had to force them open.
Yeah, but also, like I said, it's just communicating to people what you're doing, you know, and that's how you just gain the support. So I want to answer your second question, but if you could just repeat it once again.
Well, I have to now remember. But it was also attracting good staff. But I'm just going to stick on one thing, because I think communication is important as well. How you convey that to either your staff or to investors or, you know, support services. So I think that's critical, because I sense when you do communicate, it all comes out, you know, and that passion comes through. And certainly for me, that strength of character comes through as well, because I think it's not an easy industry to do well in, but if you do, it can be very satisfying, and maybe that's why you know, this has still got legs. It's not like your previous business where you thought, oh, where to from now? You've got so much more to achieve. And if I then look at the sector, and you mentioned there's not many, you know, in terms of diversity of the sector, not that diverse. It's still quite traditional, still quite conservative in many ways, male-dominated. Do you see enough transformation happening? I mean, I open saying that, you know, around, it's an estimate of 10% of production is from black producers. But what is your view on transformation? What is your view on diversity within the sector and on youth? Because if you look at the average age, and you might have read that article about, you know, 1 in 5 farmers are leaving the sector. And I looked at it and I thought, well, some of it is an international trend where there are farmers sort of exiting. The age of farmers around the world is sort of in the 50s plus. So maybe to some extent that's there. Maybe South Africa, we have some unique challenges. Rural crime, etc., could be a worry. Lack of succession and so on. But if I just focus a bit on transformation, the lack of it, do you see enough happening? And we've just seen the sort of agriculture and the agro-master plan being signed in by Minister Toka Didiza.
Yeah.
And I think that is another stepping stone. We can maybe dwell on that a bit more later. But what's your view on transformation? And after that, I'd like you to talk about including the small-scale farmers, how we assist them in being sustainable. I'm not necessarily saying all becoming large commercial, but being sustainable.
Right. So I'll start off by answering that question with the previous question I remember, because you asked me how long did it take me to get the support even from workers. And quite frankly, it took maybe a good 2 years, you know, because a lot of my workforce when I started out farming were maybe 10, 15 years my senior. Right? I wasn't born and bred in a family of farmers. And so it took a lot of work to also transform their mindset, that a young person can lead them, that a young person who wasn't born and bred in the industry might see a different viewpoint in how to penetrate this industry and successfully grow into it. And so it started with, being an unknown environment, unknown territory for me, but also transforming the mindset of employees, that they can be led by a young individual, and that through their support as employees, a young individual like myself can also succeed. From a transformation point of view, I think there's various elements in which we could look at it. From a woman's perspective, I think the industry is transformed. Not so much, you don't see a lot of women in key leadership strategic decision-making positions. However, they are there in playing supportive roles with many agri-organizations that you see today. From a youth perspective, young people have always been around in the sector, but I think it's just how the sector has intentionally looked to maybe put a lens on certain type of farmers, let's say the most established, the more commercial, because that's where everybody wants to be in, right? Everybody wants to do business, wants to trade, wants to grow their companies. So typically they'll gravitate to the more established farmers. However, you know, the bottom part of the spectrum, they are young people, they are women, remote areas, urban areas that have been farming for many, many years. But I think also it's important not to only look at the primary level of the agriculture industry, secondary and tertiary. I think it has definitely transformed. I mean, we see now, we definitely seeing a lot more younger professionals in leadership positions, influencing policies, influencing agricultural organizations that have been in existence for more than 20, 30 years. We're seeing a lot of more women as well in corporates that are just changing how corporate agri organizations are also run. We're seeing the introduction of tech changing the agricultural landscape. So it's definitely transforming it, right? We're getting a lot of professionals who are generally working outside the agriculture sector now honing inside the agriculture sector. So like you're seeing a lot of tech guys, finance guys merging with technology and how to transform the way we finance businesses in agriculture. So I think that industry is transforming and it's gradually growing. Furthermore, we're seeing a lot of private investments, private equity firm or investment equity firms or venture capitalists starting to see that there's this huge industry that's quite untapped from an investment perspective. Maybe they've been investing in mines and constructions and all these other industries. But there's a huge appetite to now invest within the agricultural sector, obviously having food security into mind. So now we're seeing a diverse portfolios of organizations who want to finance and fund for the long term, also wanting to play and have a stake in the sector. So it's transforming not only from a private level, from where I sit, not only from a private, primary production perspective, but also secondary and tertiary. And it's quite interesting to see how and where we will be in the next 10 years.
Yeah, and I suppose just to emphasize that, if you look at the primary contribution to the GDP, and it's, we're less than 3%, it's probably 2.5, 2.6% direct contribution from an agricultural point of view. But if you look at those linkages backwards and forwards, the multiple is 6 times or more. And that talks to you saying it's attracting people from far wider than just the traditional view of the sector. And even though the likes of Ollie, for example, are now, he's a tech guy and he's been exposed to agriculture. And sometimes I think he's getting so excited by this agricultural world that he might switch over as well. But before we go there, Ollie, Mbali, I wanted to talk a little bit about the small-scale farmers. And I know that in the Eastern Cape, as I said in my opening, that you are the CEO of a non-profit organisation assisting between 1,000 and 1,500 small-scale farmers. What blew me away was that when you look at a production season, and we'll take a number for the sake of this discussion, it costs you 10,000 Rand per hectare to plant a hectare of maize under rain-fed conditions. And we know the Eastern Cape is one of Grain SA's focus areas in terms of expansion. And these farmers will have the ability to come up with 50% of that, 5,000 Rand towards their production costs, cash, And that I found very interesting, because the commitment then was to put their own money in and obviously to match it with wherever you can get funding, whether it's grant funding or loan funding or a combination or whatever. So tell me a bit more about what the non-profit organisation does and why you're so excited about it, including what it means to those rural communities as well. Because yes, it is small scale, but wow, there's a lot more than just producing the maize.
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot more, and just I think people just need to be serviced, and I think that's pretty much the key to our success. So Kanya Farmer Development was started 3 years ago by a gentleman who's a farmer in the Eastern Cape. And when I met him late last year, I thought, okay, what he's doing is quite phenomenal. With the minimal support, he was able to get the organization to such a point. And you start to see the hunger from the farmers who's saying, we've been farming maize for 15, 20 years, but we're in the Eastern Cape. It's discussed on various media platforms through up to government to saying Eastern Cape must be transformed, Eastern Cape must be serviced, but nobody's actually doing anything. Yeah. So it just took a young entrepreneur, a young farmer just to say, okay, yes, I'm farming the Eastern Cape in my small little corner, but I'm attracting other small-scale farmers who are saying, how are you doing it? So predominantly our existence as a Kanya Farmer Development is providing access to inputs, access to subsidies, and access to information on how to grow maize commercially. Yes. And when I say commercial, we're striving for tonnage, right? So it's farmers who are farming on communal land, some on private-owned land, but and who have been farming maize. It's not new entrants. They've been farming for many years. However, the access from a service perspective, getting the right seeds, getting the right chemicals, getting the right knowledge to prevent risks that may come in the next season, they haven't had that. So this is just what we're offering them, right? And so you look at the demographics, again, we think rural people are just forgotten individuals who are illiterate and so forth. But these are our fathers and parents, grandparents who had served in the country from being teachers, policemen, lawyers, etc., yes, who are in retirement. And yes, they have the capital, and for them it's important to grow maize, because in the rural landscape, if you've got livestock, that's also generally how you're perceived to be wealthy. So for in the rural areas, maize plays an important part, where it's just to feed from your livestock and also generate a bit of money in that. And then also another aspect that we don't see, there's so many other business people in the rural landscape who've got a little bit of money who are farming. For example, there are taxi drivers who've grown transportation businesses over and above just taxis, but buses, etc. They have capital. They understand that the money is in the land. They've been farming cattle, they've been farming maize, but yet again, not as successful as to reach the tonnage that a commercial farmer will do. So as Ukanya Farmer Development, we're teaching the people in the rural areas to say, this is how you farm maize commercially. This is the plant population that you should have in your hectare, etc., and the list goes on. And furthermore, we're just saying, okay, we understand that to maybe make it successful in the agri-industry, you need a lot of money, you need a bit of capital investment, right?
Yes.
And so we've come on board to say, okay, if you can bring half of the money, we can match that. But it's not something that we're looking at it for long term, right? Because at the end of the day, a farmer needs to stand by themselves, and run their own business. And so that's the purpose of the organization. And, our long-term strategic vision is to continue subsidies, but not rely a lot from our grant and donors and funders, but find other avenues where the NPO can generate its own capital to be able to support its own operations, because we never know when the taps might run dry. But I think we're just doing a lot of work and just basically just providing access to inputs, quality inputs to the farmers, and that's our key to success and delivering on those objectives.
Well, I think, what is so exciting about that, though, is that the benefit of the work you're doing has been felt by the farmers. So they're saying, we're getting value out of what you are doing, which maybe, unfortunately, hasn't been there previously. I think the other important thing is that transforming the landscape, and in an agricultural sense, it doesn't only mean at the top end, the big commercial guys and, boosting exports. It starts in our rural communities. It starts with household food security, which is still a major issue for us. And then it's about their self-belief and their pride in having a business, which not only meets the household food security, but their surplus to sell. And that in itself creates sustainability and economy in those areas, because some of that maize is milled and sold, and some is sold to feed companies, so there might be some off-takers in that regard. So I think it's that economy, and I know in Nation in Conversation there is some discussions later in the week about the regeneration of our rural communities, and that to me is hugely important. So Mbali, thank you for that. We're probably going to come back to you a bit later. But I'm going to chat to Ollie, because Ollie, there was a lot about technology, and you heard Mbali's opening statement of how, at the very basic level of technology, Google was her friend, and if she needed to find suppliers or information or whatever, Google, and that's where she started until she could build up the networks and get trusted advisors in. So if you could, in your experience, and I know your entrance to agriculture is more recent, and some of the discussions we've been having about the role of technology in an agricultural sense. So why don't you take us, because I know you're a tech specialist, but what are your early ideas around the role of tech in agriculture, and then we can dive into some of the detail a bit later.
Yeah, and I think the starting point with the role of tech is that, it must be tech not for tech's sake, but I think tech for the sector's sake, tech for the economy's sake, and for humanity's sake. For me, the higher order, I guess, challenge that technology must assist us with is food security. I know that you mentioned that in South Africa the issue is not as dire, but in the global context, it is quite huge. Firstly, we have a wastage of up to half of the things that we produce as the world. And secondly, because populations are increasing. In fact, the Food and Agriculture Organization tells us that by 2050, we need to produce 70% more of what we produce today.
Yes.
So that becomes critically important for a market like South Africa, which is a net exporter. especially also in the African context, to ensure that there's sufficient supply. So, and I think that's where technology comes in. Because, it's not like we're going to get more land. We have to do more with what we have, do more with less. So then the role of technology becomes increasingly important in efficient production, efficient farming, and that's where you see, smart technologies being employed on the ground through things like Internet of Things, sensors, and so forth, to increase the levels of efficiency in the system. I think also technology is important in increasing transparency in the system.
Yes.
And that brings about, I think, also integrity in the system and in the value chain. So those are the critical things at a very high level that I see. But more important for me is, in us adopting technology in agriculture, it's critically important that we do not leave behind the smaller farmers, small-scale producers in the process. So the biggest challenge I think we have is, how do we proliferate this access to technology, make it available even to the smaller scale farmers? In South Africa and in Africa in particular, I think we've got a challenge in terms of barriers of adoption from a technology perspective, largely driven by, firstly, I think things like access to infrastructure. Africa is sub-Sahara in particular. We have some of the lowest coverages insofar as broadband is concerned.
Yes.
We actually have the lowest in the world. And while governments are doing more and more to try and increase internet penetration and so forth, but until we solve those fundamental infrastructural issues, I don't think we can unlock the potential of technology, particularly insofar as helping the smaller guys. And I think those are the challenges we need to solve for.
That's a really good point, because often when I talk about infrastructure, I'm talking about roads and railways and dams and irrigation schemes. But here it's technology infrastructure and the cost of data. Mbali was mentioning the cost of data for these small-scale farmers in the Eastern Cape. How do we reduce that and improve the access?
Yeah.
If I then take this train of thought, because what I was also hearing from you is that the customer is starting to place increased pressure. So you're talking about traceability of food, safety, food safety, and obviously the emergence of blockchain technology, and that can help with that.
Yes.
So we see a lot of the change being driven by the consumer, and even the sustainability credentials as well, of the sector are being scrutinized. But there has been, over the last 2 years, the emergence of e-commerce platforms that have been assisting the farmers to link directly with their consumer market or their clients. And in some ways, they might be looking at it from an efficiency point of view, because they're cutting out the middle person. And in other ways, they've got a story to tell as well. So they can convey that story to their end client more directly. And I think the wine industry is a good example of that, where farmers, 10th generation, have got a really special story to tell, and the way that technology helps with that. But what I also wanted to talk to you is that some of these platforms, e-commerce platforms, and Nedbank Avo is one of them. And with you heading up Nedbank Avo business to business in particular, what are you starting to look at, or what are some of the early indications of the role that Nedbank Avo can play from an agricultural point of view? Because it's starting to touch on many of the things that I've just spoken about. Yeah.
And I think the role of e-commerce in that regard is huge. As I mentioned, there's a wastage problem. That's one, meaning that there's the produce that the system or the sector actually produce can actually reach more end consumers at the end of the day, so long as you produce more effectively. To my earlier point around doing more with less. The platform economy or the e-commerce space definitely does provide an opportunity from a route to market perspective. So if we just think about the farmers that Bali was talking about in the Eastern Cape, the opportunity now exists through these e-commerce platforms to actually take some of their supplies and make them available to markets, firstly within the Eastern Cape regions, but even beyond, because what these platforms tend to come with is support from a full e-commerce perspective, logistics, and so forth. So there's a huge access to market opportunity that opens up, which can actually grow the income by, as high as 100%, sometimes even grow it twofold. But also, I think it makes it easier to distribute your products because part of the greatest value of selling online is the cost of sale is much lower compared to traditional channels where you have to have people running around selling and so forth and so forth. So that's the big opportunity that the platform economy, e-commerce marketplaces like Avo do present. On the one hand, direct access to the consumer in addition to your customers in the value chain. That opens that up, which is a huge market on its own. But I think reaching regions that traditionally or ordinarily you wouldn't have reached, including export markets, I think those are the big things.
Yeah. And you did make mention of food waste, and my estimation or the reading I've done is that up to a third of all food is wasted somewhere, either at primary production or in the value chain, or by the consumer themselves, who throw away food. And so I think in our country in particular, and there are 2 points here. One is the zero hunger, and the other then is the benefit it has from a sustainability point of view. So every ton of food recovered results in 3 to 4 tons of savings of greenhouse gas. And if you start to think about that, it's actually, I think, one of the top 5 most effective ways in terms of reducing greenhouse gases is to food recovery.
Yes.
And I suppose technology can play a role with that, not only possibly in helping channel donations to the likes of Food Forward SA, which do outstanding work. And I'm going to ask Daniel to talk a bit more about Food Forward SA a bit later. But the work they do in terms of a recovery of food and then redistributing that food to needy households.
Yeah.
But sorry, you want to add to that?
Absolutely, because and you mentioned Avo B2B, which we've just recently launched, and we have focused specifically on the agricultural sector as one of the core focus areas. And one of the things that constantly comes out from the farmers themselves is that not only do we want to use platforms like this from an access to market perspective, but also how can we redistribute excess supplies, I suppose, to actually avoid food wastage. And I think that's where technologies that are good at using data science to actually match supply and demand, not just from a commercial perspective, but in terms of needy households and communities through social causes partners like Food Forward SA. And I think for me that's the beauty of this e-commerce space, the ability to really link the profit motive with the purpose motive in kind of one ecosystem and do both.
Yes. And I've noticed with farmers, in fact, often they're spoken about as being conservative in terms of their uptake of new ideas and changing farming methods. But from a technology point of view, I think it's really what's kept us in the game. Combating that cost price squeeze. Technology's had a big role to play. And of course, not only that, doing more with less, as you said, but it's really for farmers in terms of ease of doing business. They're quite remote, many of them. And if you look where we are now, your next door neighbor might be 5K. If you're in the Karoo, it might be 10, 15 kilometers away, your next door neighbor. So, and even on your own farm, how do you use technology to be much more efficient, And there are lots of good examples around that where a very basic one has been able to do your banking from home and not having to go into your branch, And that's a bit old school now, but if you're saving time for farmers and you're making their ease of doing business, it's a no-brainer for them, and it's a no wonder for me that they are adopting technology as they are. So Daniel, you're the banker on the panel here, in the true sense, from an agricultural point of view anyway.
Yeah.
Can I ask you, if we take almost a step back, but just tell us about Nedbank's purpose, because it's a recent change in Nedbank, fairly recent, where we have a purpose as a bank and it drives a lot of what we do. Can you tell us a bit about Nedbank's purpose, and then maybe expand on sustainability, the sustainable development goals, which is an underpin to our purpose?
Yeah, no, thanks, John. While you were talking, I was actually thinking, and you referred to how long I've been in banking, since 1991. So before I perhaps just touch on Nedbank itself, looking back in history, so take a step back, how the agricultural sector actually transformed over time as well. You know, when I started in banking, it was a very regulated environment, you know, from a marketing perspective, but also from a funding perspective, where the old, I can call it in Afrikaans, landboukrediet, was still fully functional, offering 40-year bonds, you know, at a 3% fixed interest over that period. You know, to make it affordable for new entrants into the market and your small commercial farmers to actually remain profitable over a period of time. And then since 1994, you know, we saw deregulation, and actually with a lot more challenges, but even more opportunities, you know, for our entrepreneurs into the market. But then what we saw actually was a gradual reduction in affordable finance. And it became increasingly, I think, more difficult, especially for new entrants into the market, to get affordable funding. You know, so I think that is one of the discussion points, you know, that we need to touch on as well. But when you talk about Nedbank, and you're quite right, now if you look at Nedbank's purpose, it actually moved away from lending to doing good. So if you can just quote the purpose, you know, it is we try to use our financial expertise, not lending, but expertise, to do good for individuals, for the families, for businesses, as well as society. So we try to do good over the whole spectrum, you know, of society. And I think that is quite a bold step that Nedbank took, you know, over the course of the last few years. Obviously, Nedbank being a green bank too. And if you look at, and I'm going to touch on partnerships, but the road that we've walked, you know, with a business such as the Worldwide Fund for Nature over the last 30 years, more than 300 million from money from Nedbank as well as from our clients, you know, investing into the societies itself, but also into nature conservation. But that's just one point. But, you know, when we talk about transforming a business, for me, you can't transform if you're not sustainable. A business and an industry needs to be sustainable. And I'll try to perhaps just touch on 3 legs of sustainability and where Nedbank actually fits in and what we try to do in each of those 3 legs. And the first one, obviously it is financial sustainability, and is also social sustainability that I'm going to touch on. But then is actually conservation. And what we try to do around conservation, especially with partners such as WWF. You know.
Yeah, and Daniel, if I can just dwell on that a bit, because I think the partners are important, and we see increasingly the value that partners can bring. And certainly the WWF has been a long-standing partner, you know, and from the environmental point of view, been a really good support for Nedbank. But more importantly for me over the last few years, and this is what I've seen, I'm going to ask you about this, is that they understand that the agricultural sector needs to be sustainable. So you're driving the environmental outcome, but you need farmers on the land who are custodians of the land to continue to look after the land, and hopefully in a better way than what you might have done over history. So tell me about that, because I think it was last year, there was a business case done which involved the WWF and the Trace and Save down in the Eastern Cape, which is a consultancy business that looks at environmental measures, and it, as the name implies, Trace and Save. And there, if I'm not mistaken, it's one of the very few studies that has come out that is linking the benefits of sustainability with financial sustainability.
Correct.
Can you tell me, those are dairy farmers in particular?
Correct, yeah. Obviously, when we talk about the environmental side again of the business, South Africa is a water scarce country. We don't have surplus water. We're in constant competition with urbanization, and agri just needs to give away water. We don't have high potential soils. I think that was part of the study, actually, to see, but what can we do around the improvement of soil health and the impact that it can have on profitability in the dairy sector. Quite an extensive case study that was done, and obviously the conclusion was, by looking after your soil, by improving your soil quality, by using less water as well, because your soil structure improves so much,
Yes.
It actually became a lot more profitable and sustainable as well.
Yes.
You can have short-term profitability, but you need like long-term sustainability in your business too, by looking after your natural resources.
And
so that was for me actually a brilliant study that was done by WWF and Trace and Safe, yes.
Yeah, and I suppose that the point is, if I look at Nedbank, in terms of driving sustainability and the funding of the SDGs, we spend about 130 odd million on CSR spending, but that's a drop in the ocean. Yes, it's a big number, but in the context of what Nedbank does, and we lend between 180 and 200 billion. So if you want to drive change, then you use your lending as a lever. And Daniel, can you tell me a little bit about our approach to lending and driving change through lending, and how we're looking to build more of a holistic view of sustainability? So it's not about only energy and water. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
For me, then it comes to the second leg of sustainability, being financially sustainable. And for financial sustainability, you need to look at energy, and you need to look at profitability, you need to look at productivity. And then, as a bank, Nedbank prioritized 9 out of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. But in agriculture, we're looking at predominantly 3, where we try to focus on actually developing a soil health client value proposition at this stage, but focusing a lot on water efficiencies as well as renewable energy. Given the risk that we currently face in agriculture, especially with a lack of energy and uncertainty around energy, especially with load shedding. We've seen quite a big movement towards renewable energy, and also looking at water efficiencies, and bringing that into, I think, quite a unique finance offering that we've developed over the last few years, is actually to do that type of funding as cash flow neutral as possible. And that meant that we had to extend our funding terms more to the lifespan of perhaps of that specific asset that we finance, but then also to look at that we need to do it as cash flow neutral as possible, so that it's not more expensive than what you're currently paying for electricity, or even with looking at water efficiencies. So that was quite a bold step, I think, that we took. But I must also mention then that over the course of the last few years, we've actually seen that your break-even point is coming down year on year, as that type of asset is becoming a lot more affordable. Also with new technologies, I think that's exponential technology growth that we've seen in that space, John.
Thank you, Daniel, because I think, as you say, the payback period on renewable energy has come down significantly, and many farmers are starting to see it as a viable alternative, apart from the security of supply, of course, the load shedding, but just in terms of pegging the costs going forward. And Dirk, in the grain industry, how much of this sustainability transformation is happening? Because there are major issues that we're facing. We're talking about soil health, water efficiency, and so on. And do you see that coming through with the grain farmers as well?
Yeah, definitely, John. I think that what Daniel mentioned as well is, if you just look at our type of soils that we have in South Africa, it's the soils of variability in terms of in a field of what types of soils and the different types of depths of soils and everything in that,
Yes.
it's difficult to manage for us. So
Yes.
we don't have the type of quality soils that other countries have. But
Yes.
we manage to get on top of in terms of water scarcity, we manage all of those factors within one sphere.
Yeah.
And it becomes utmost important to make sure our soil health is as good as possible. And that's why we're doing studies currently linked with data where we take literally one field and we change one field into a field that takes up with data 2,000 experimental plots.
Yes.
And where we try to manage to say where's the optimal space given all this variability in soil. And the reason for that is to make sure that we get the best out of the soils and to make sure that that best out of the soils is optimal.
Yes.
Meaning that the biggest yield is not necessarily the most profitable space. But also making sure that you safeguard in terms of the natural resources you have.
Yes.
Because that's the only resource you have. And if you don't look after it, in the next 5 or 6 years, if that's gone, it's gone in the system.
Yes.
And it takes up time and a lot of money to recuperate back that soil. So the farmers currently is very focused in the grain industry to make sure that our soils is up of good standard, that our soils is managed in that way as well,
Yeah.
to make sure that we go forward in terms of sustainability. Now, a good explanation, as Daniel mentioned, in the 90s, what resources we had on the financial side. The second thing is also, as time progressed, and you've mentioned the amount of farmers that's leaving the industry as well. And the important thing is, it's not hectares leaving the industry; it's individuals leaving the industry.
Yes.
So that makes that farmers gets bigger, and the reasons for that is because it's about the efficiencies. It's the guys that manage to get all that efficiencies in place because
Yes.
there's just no space not to be efficient.
Yes.
The second part in terms of it is, if you look at the margins and the recovery rates, is the margins is becoming smaller and the recovery rates are becoming longer.
Yeah.
So with our variable climate, variable soils, all those type of risks, now when you have low margins, the moment you hit a drought scenario,
Yes.
it takes you 5, 7, 8 years to recover from that one drought scenario.
Yeah.
Where in the
Yeah.
90s we could recuperate 2 or
Much
3
quicker.
seasons,
Yeah.
and then you're up and on
Yeah.
the legs again and you can go. Now it changed quite vastly. Because
Yeah.
of these margins, you need to have that efficiencies, and part of it is sustainability of soils. If
Okay.
the soil is our main natural resource together with the water. And if you don't look after that, you just won't be in the system anymore.
And we're going to go to the panel just for a couple of questions before we wrap up. I'm going to ask each of you to do a closing statement. But before we go to the panel, Mbali, I mean, sitting here listening to all of this and the climate risk and the need to build climate resilience, and it might be different for you in hydroponics to the farmers in the Eastern Cape, etc. So, I mean, how do we transfer some of this knowledge and this thinking and this access to technology to those farmers? Because where you've started, I suppose, is in the right place. You're saying, if we just do the basics right, we can lift them from 2 ton a hectare to 5 ton a hectare, okay? And that already puts them into the game, and there's a bit of surplus to sell. But how do we, over time, start to assist the farmers with building climate resilience to ensure that their soils are really up there and it can start to better withstand droughts and that going forward? I mean, is that part of your thinking going forward as an NPO, as to transforming the landscape as well as assisting farmers in better coping?
Yes, I think it's partly to do with everything that Dirk has just said. You know, as a farmer, you have to think long term, start to see the small little bits that make up your business enterprise, and like you said, profits, margins, etc., soil health. And for us, it's also just now starting to introduce the importance of crop rotation. You know, maybe start to reduce no-till farming methods. You know, because again, within the Eastern Cape, as much as it has vast untapped land, there are areas where the soil is degrading in some form because of climate change.
Yes.
So for us, it's also just transforming the mindset of the farmers to say, do companion planting, add different commodities so that your soil can become rich, because again, we're in this for the long term, right?
Yes.
A lot of the farming enterprises in South Africa are generational as well. So if they want to pass something down to their kids, they need to start adopting these methods right now. Introduction of technology to the farmers at very basic levels, because how do you give somebody an app when they just don't have access to water? An app is not a need, the water is a need. And so it's just bringing certain technologies, maybe that could assist them from a production level. And it's also, we're currently empowering the people that we have internally, who we call mentors, which are pretty much extension officers, empowering them to be able to use technology in their daily lives so that they can make informed decisions and assist farmers when they're on the ground and teaching them. So yeah, we are an organization that's adopting technology, and being a huge tech fan, because I've seen the efficiencies it has afforded me within my own farm. I'm definitely infusing this within this NPO, and we're going to be heavily reliant on technology going forward. Not only to obviously do reporting, but analyze data, like Dirk said, analyze where we're going to see ourselves in the next couple of years, analyze how successful farmers will be, and also make decisions in terms of we can preempt tonnage, what is it that we could be expecting, and then maybe to converse with the likes of the Avos to say, for the next season, we might be bringing X amount of tons for grains, which will be available for trade.
Exactly. So I think there's some really exciting ideas, and I like this broad spectrum from small to large, that we've been talking about. But if I go to the audience, I don't know if there's one or two questions that you'd like to pose. If you do pose a question, just single out who you're posing it to. Sean.
Good morning, all. I think my question is both for Dirk and Daniel. Sustainability, it's clear it's important in today's industry and market. And I think, first of all, is what type of solutions or products or advice do you have to clients with regards to funding the sustainable options, what are available? And then secondly, Dirk, we've seen in the past, prices, as an example, every 3 to 5 years increase. So I think my question is with regards to the latest prices that you get on maize and soya, is it going to stay the same? Did we see that jump? Is it going to stay there to help with regards to the finance of these solutions, or are we going to see a decline again? Thank you.
Thank you. Daniel, do you want to kick off with very briefly some of the funding solutions we have? And then we'll get Dirk to tackle the tricky bit about prices.
Thanks. I think when you look at funding the different solutions, for me it's horses for courses. There's not a single funding solution for like overarching the different financing options that we've got. If you look at renewable energy as example, you do asset-based finance. When you look at solar systems, where you actually just take that specific asset as security and you do it through normal ABFs over a longer period. But then if you look at improving soil health and moving towards regenerative type of agriculture, you look at capital moratoriums on term funding as an example for up to 3 years, where you don't have to repay any capital during that period, to give you that grace period to actually improve your soil to the extent that you can farm more profitably after that.
And Daniel, maybe it's about having rich conversation with your clients and understanding their unique needs, and then structuring something around it. That's what I'm hearing, which could include shade netting, it could include extended term on the funding, et cetera. But I suppose it's the idea is to how do you combat some of these challenges, climate challenges, and build a climate resilient business. Dirk, over to you with the prices, and then we've got, I think, one more question before we wrap up.
We can see he's from the University of the Free State. He's asking difficult questions. I think that the first thing is that's the beauty of a free market system. So in a free market system, normally the market corrects itself at some point of stage, and it's literally looking at the macro view of it. Currently, if we look at the prices in South Africa, we for most of our crops, we had export parity prices, which is actually the lowest price you can be relative to the international market.
Yes.
And that means we've got, in a world context, very cheap grain in South Africa.
Okay.
The question is, if the international prices change, what happened to the local environment? And that's the risk currently we're sitting with. If international prices decrease and we still have these high inputs, then we'll have problems.
Yeah.
The beauty of a free market system is then you'll see lower plantage, you will see lower producers planting less of the crops, and that means that the price will increase again, helping it. The question we're sitting currently with as economists is to say, if we look at disposable income and we look at what people can afford for food, that's starting to create concerns.
Yeah.
Because in a whole world context, it's not just in South Africa, it's becoming very expensive if you look just at the soft commodities in that regard.
Yeah.
And that's where the question is, where will you see any resistance? Where will you see that resistance? And what will be the substitution effects in terms of it? And that's where some head scratching is happening. In South Africa, we know maize is our staple food, but we know there's also shifts these days away from maize, then something to like rice, due to affordability. And that's where a lot of our questions currently lies. Where will you see that consumer pressure to say, I can't afford this anymore at these prices? So we know for food purposes, we can't stay at these prices. But then we need to have that adjustment on the lower side of the input costs. And that adjustment will come when the supply chains, it's not that there's a shortage, it's a supply chain issue.
Yeah.
The moment that the supply chains find themselves again, you'll see changes in it. And what we see already is what happens in the world is specifically with the war, where it's two countries that play a predominant big role in terms of the grain industry. Suddenly you see a lot of areas open up again, which was areas that they didn't utilize for planting because it was just not worthwhile. But now with the prices, suddenly they say these areas are worthwhile for planting. So the whole economy's got its way of resetting itself. It's just the timing phase. And we all know agriculture works in cycles. And the best place to be is to be through that cycle. If you can manage through a cycle, then you will manage through it. And you must put yourself in a position to manage through that cycles.
So I think that is certainly good advice. Thank you, Dirk. Is there one more question from the audience? Quite bright out there. You, in the back corner.
Yeah, thank you very much, John. I think my question is really around transformation and sustainability. That was largely touched on the panel. And I think our producer there in the middle, her story is very beautiful. So my question is, what is the bank's, specifically maybe Nedbank, how far are we in terms of supporting the small businesses to start entering the market? Because the biggest risk is that access to capital, and I think our panelists mentioned that venture capitalists are also coming into play. And maybe for Dirk as well, is there any initiatives that Grain SA is driving to support black farmers? Thank you very much.
Well, maybe, I'm not sure who wants to, Dirk, maybe you can start with the Grain SA response around that. I don't know if Daniel wants to speak to some of the initiatives like the blended finance scheme, possibly Daniel, but or Mbali as well, you maybe see it from a different perspective. But this is going to be our last sort of wrap up, and then I'm going to close the panel discussion. So a short answer from you, Dirk.
Yeah,
and,
I see the time is limited, so I'll provide a short answer, definitely. We've got two focus areas. One is typically the same as Mbali's side, where we look at the smaller 1 hectare guys, home food security.
Yeah.
And there it's based on the same principles. Providing input, providing support for input. It's exactly the same principles. And then we've also got a big focus in terms of getting farmers more to commercial status. And there we've got the normal barriers of entry, obtaining enough funding for capital. And the big thing is these farmers don't necessarily always have the history to showcase their repayment capabilities.
Yeah.
And that's where in the 90s we had very nice structures to say, we're willing to take a risk on you to show your repayment capabilities going forward.
Yeah.
And that's where we're currently lacking a bit in that instances is there's to get a farmer that's already got access to land, that's already got a lot in place, to get them that capital to put them into the next level. And it's purely because of that low margins. You need a lot of capital to substitute that low margins to get them in that repayment phase. And that's where we have some of the challenges going forward, and where we invest a lot of energy in to assist those producers.
All right. I'm going to give Daniel the last word from the panel. Maybe briefly, Daniel, on the blended finance scheme, which I think starts to address some of what you're saying.
Yeah, I think the biggest problem, John, is access to finance. And not just access to finance, but access to very affordable finance, and that includes grants. So I think when the blended finance scheme eventually kicks in, and that will definitely assist a lot, by establishing more sustainable small-scale farming businesses. But at this stage, I think we have to look at partnerships. Partnerships with industry bodies, partnerships with the value chain, and strong commercial farmers. For me, that will be, very shortly, that will be the success story going forward.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. I can't agree more on the partnerships, and I'm going to wrap up this panel discussion. I did say I'd give you each a closing statement, but I see there's a red time up. So, but it's been a discussion which I think we could continue for at least another 2 hours probably. But in terms of wrapping up, I think the partnerships is key, and we've probably been working in silos too much, and I know that's not always easy to break, but certainly the partnerships, the involvement of the value chain, and more of a holistic view on it. And quite frankly, and Mbali, you made specific mention that the sector at large is unhappy with the service they get, largely from government. But I would think that the role is for government is to create the right environment, to have the right policies. Clarity of policy would be important. Yes, to introduce grant funding, but for the private sector to run with that, to implement it, and including the NPOs like yourself that have proved yourselves. So, the partnership between the NPOs and the John Deeres, the Nedbanks of this world, the commodity associations, I think have a vital role to play. I think if we can pull it together, we have an amazing future. It'll start to tackle some of those things like food security. We need to partner with Food Forward SA, for example. And we do a lot of work with them, and they do outstanding jobs. So that's part of the solution. But the flip side of it is getting our producers more efficient, more sustainable in the longer term. So thank you to the panel members. Thank you to Dirk. Thank you, Mbali.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, Ole.
Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. It's been a great discussion. And I look forward to what I think is a great platform in agriculture. The last 2 years, I think there's a positive vibe. There is a lot to tackle. But I think it's vibrant, it's competitive, it's internationally competitive. And Dirk, you're mentioning these challenges that face the industry and our farmers having to deal with it. I think it's actually made us stronger, because those are things that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. So thank you to the panel. Thank you for a great discussion. And I look forward to a lot more discussions at NAMPO, and best of luck for the rest of the week. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay.